Hello and welcome back. This is the week 5 lecture. So this week we are working on essay 1, which is the descriptive narrative. This is our first major essay of the semester. Kind of exciting. If you have not already, please take a look at the assignment details and instructions. I've already posted those in our modules so you can see them in the week 5 module. And also, if you click on the assignments tab, you'll be able to see all of our assignments, and you can already read what those, see what those major essays are. So, like we've said, our first, writing style or major writing technique that we've been tackling this semester is the narrative. So now that we've learned about it, we've read lots of examples, we've talked about descriptive language, which, as we know, is a very important part of narrative. Now it's time for us to write our own narratives. So if you have any questions about the assignment, about the guidelines, just let me know. Email me. If you want to run an idea or a topic by me, that's fine. But as I state in the instructions, this narrative that you're writing can be fiction. It can also be nonfiction. It can be something that really happened to you, or it can be a story that you totally made up. If you enjoy creative writing, if you like to come up with stories, then maybe you lean towards fiction. If you don't really love fiction, then you might want to keep your narrative strictly factual. You can think of yourself as kind of a historian or a journalist, somebody trying to simply capture an event or reveal something important that really did happen. So it works either way because, like we've been seeing the last few weeks, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, most narratives will contain a lot of the same elements. They're going to contain good descriptive details and language. And, we can really be pretty free and open with this assignment. We're going to have slightly more strict rules for future essays, but the narrative, by definition, is kind of an imaginative, more sort of expansive category or genre. So we can have fun, be creative if we want to be. But again, if you're not sure about your topic or if you're not quite sure how to approach the assignment, just reach out to me and we can talk more. And one final thing I'll say about it is just remember, these are pretty short narratives. Now, you can go beyond the minimum length requirement that I've included in the instructions. That's fine. But just keep in mind, we're not writing a novel. We're not even writing a lengthy short story or article. So if you have the idea for a really long, in-depth, complex narrative, there's obviously nothing wrong with that. But for this assignment, you might consider just doing chapter 1 or part 1, and you might leave us with a cliffhanger, and you could perhaps come up with a sequel or the next installment later on. Just consider that if your narrative feels kind of big, because I don't mind going past the 3 to 4 page minimum, but once we get beyond like 8 to 10 pages is probably too long. And at that point, you probably need to scale it down a little bit for the purposes of this assignment. Okay, so we're going to talk about 2 things here in the week 5 lecture. Obviously, I want us to get started working on essay 1. So I'll primarily be focusing on the writing process, something that we've maybe mentioned in passing, but we haven't talked about it very much yet. And this is very important for us during any big essay writing week. So we have 4 major essays throughout the course of the semester. So we're going to have 4 weeks like this, where we're basically just putting together a big essay. And I want us to follow the steps of the writing process as I lay them out to you. So that information's also in the week 5 overview. You can take a look. We're going to go over that in the second half of lecture because I want you to be comfortable with the writing process, not just for essay 1. I want you to continue to use it and refer back to it for all of our future essays, and maybe even some discussion posts. Sometimes you need to take a process-oriented approach to discussions as well, especially if they're a little bit lengthier. So that will be the second half of lecture. And the first half, I want to do something that we really haven't done at all yet this semester. And it's something that many people perhaps don't enjoy, but it's necessary. It's important. I want to get into some nuts and bolts when it comes to writing, particularly when it comes to sentences. Individual sentences. I want us to think a little bit more this week as we start writing Essay 1. I want us to think more about the sentences that we write. And today, I want us to think a little bit about sentence structure or syntax. How are our sentences arranged? How clear are our sentences? How easy will they be to read and understand? And of course, also, we want to make sure that our sentences are grammatically correct, that they contain the proper punctuation, but more than anything, we want them to work. We want them to make sense. We want them to connect with the reader. You should really think about the sentence as one of the most basic building blocks of any type of writing. Now, we could go even smaller. We could talk about individual words, of course. But for a more advanced audience, we can sort of skip over the very rudimentary steps and let's get into sentences. Later, we can talk about paragraphs because these are the really essential building blocks for us. Any paper that we write can only be as good as its individual sentences and paragraphs. You might have a lot of good ideas. You might really have some interesting stuff to say. But if you're not writing good sentences, if they're not clear, if they're not punctuated correctly, if they're not immediately landing with your audience, then a lot of your good ideas are kind of wasted. Like your audience doesn't understand those ideas. They don't know the ideas because you're not successfully expressing them. So I wanted to take some time today just to think about what goes into a sentence, just the basic rules for any complete sentence, stuff that I'm sure most of us know, but it's easy to forget. It can help to have a refresher. And also, I want us to think a little bit more about compound sentences and complex sentences because we are complex thinkers. You are not small children. So a lot of your sentences will be complex, which means they're going to contain multiple ideas. They're going to contain multiple phrases, multiple clauses. And when we have complex sentences like that, as you might imagine, there's a lot of moving parts. If we have multiple ideas, multiple clauses, and we're trying to combine those things into single sentences, well, we're going to need to learn some techniques. We're going to need to learn some rules about punctuation, about how to arrange words. We need to think a little bit more about what we're doing. We need to be more intentional and deliberate about the sentences that we write. Because I've noticed, and you guys are, this is true of every semester, so don't feel bad. Don't feel singled out. When I read the discussion post, I see a lot of good ideas. I see some good responses. I see that a lot of you are thinking about my questions and working through these texts and coming up with some pretty good conclusions. But on the individual sentence level, we're often making mistakes or we're a little bit unclear. We don't always go back and double check to make sure that our sentences are working. And on a really fundamental level, we just want to make sure that our sentences make sense. I'm not trying to be, funny or painfully obvious with that. That really is where we need to start. Okay, and then we also need to make sure that we are writing complete sentences. So just a quick review. Okay, again, let's just get really comfortable and well acquainted with the concept of a sentence. Because sometimes it's easy to maybe think that a sentence just happens, right? A sentence is just what you end up with when you express an idea. A sentence is just what you end up with when you type a few words that kind of go together and, okay, you end up with a sentence, you put a period at the end of it, and you move on. We need to think more carefully about our sentences because if we're not paying attention to how we are assembling them, if we're not paying attention to how they sound, if we're not paying attention to how they are punctuated, then we're often making mistakes that will hurt us later. And again, we might not be making our points very clearly because our sentences are not very clear. So again, to have a complete sentence, as we probably know, we need three things in place. We need to have a subject. Okay, that is the actor. That is the person or thing that is doing the action in the sentence. Okay, so we have to have a subject. And that subject needs to be stated or implied in a way that's clear to your audience. All right, that's step one. The next thing that we need is a verb. We need some kind of an action. Right? Something is happening in the sentence. There is some action that's taking place, and the subject is the one doing the action. And then finally, we need the sentence to express a complete thought. If in doubt, fall back on that third element. Ask yourself, does the sentence express a complete thought? What that means is, can the sentence stand alone? If you gave that sentence to me, could I read it and understand completely the thought that you're trying to express? Or would you need to give me more? Would you need to give me another sentence? Would you need to give me another phrase? Would you need to identify the subject? Would you need to add something in order to complete the thought? If the answer is yes, I need to add something, then it's probably not a complete sentence. If it's not a complete thought by itself, if it needs help, then it's probably not a complete sentence. If there's not a subject, if there's not a verb, or if it's just not a complete thought for whatever reason, then it probably needs more work. Okay? So start there. Make sure that your sentences are complete. And don't feel bad when you find a few that aren't. Because we don't always think in complete sentences, right? Sometimes we think in fragments. We'll think of an individual word or phrase. It might not be a complete thought. Maybe in our minds we can fill in those blanks and we know the rest of the thought. It's not stated, we're not saying it out loud or even thinking it specifically, but we kind of know it. So we can fill in the blanks. Neurologists have shown that this is a common problem when writing. Humans have very powerful brains. And when we forget to say something or when we overlook a detail in writing, often our minds are filling those blanks in almost unconsciously. So we might not see it on the page. We're not expressing it on the page because we know what we mean, right? We know what that sentence or phrase is supposed to mean. So you might not double check very carefully as to what's on the page because it makes sense to you. But the question is, will it make sense to other people who are not you? Other people who don't have access to your thoughts? Other people who can't get inside your brains? And that's where a lot of sentences fall apart. You might look at a fragment and say, well, yeah, I know what I mean, but Lackey's not going to know. Some other person's not going to know unless I give them more help. So that sentence is probably not complete. You probably need to do something more to it. And when we're thinking about common punctuation mistakes, two of the most common that I see are the sentence fragment and the run-on. So I've just been describing what happens a lot of times with fragments. A fragment, that just means that something less than a sentence, something less than a complete sentence, has been incorrectly punctuated as a complete sentence. So it's being treated like a full sentence, but it's really not because it's missing one of those key elements that a sentence needs in order to be complete. So if you guys open up the week 5 overview, you'll see that I've put a lot of these examples and a lot of these explanations about sentence structure into the overview. So feel free to read along as I'm talking because I'm going to be using some of those same examples that I put in the overview. So look at that example of a fragment that I give you there. I'll just read it out loud. So a couple of sentences here. First, blocking my driveway was a car. Okay, now that's fine. It's a short, simple sentence, but it's working fine, and we know it is because it expresses a complete thought. Blocking my driveway was a car. We know what that looks like. We understand what that means. Okay, but look at what comes next. A huge SUV. So I'm starting a sentence there, but I'm not finishing it because I have a subject, but I don't have a verb. What is the huge SUV doing? Well, we know, we do know because it was stated in the previous sentence. But in that next sentence, there's no action, right? I'm just identifying a noun. I'm identifying a subject, but the subject's actually not doing anything. Therefore, it's not a complete thought. A huge SUV is not a complete thought. There's a subject, but there's no verb, there's no action, so I'm not completing the thought. I'm starting the thought, but I'm not completing it. So a huge SUV by itself cannot be a complete sentence. However, I have a lot of options here. I can just make a couple of quick additions to that fragment to make it a complete sentence. I can provide an action, or I can extend the thought, or I can find a way to attach the fragment to the complete sentence that comes before it. I might be able to end up with one slightly longer sentence that contains what was the original complete sentence followed by a phrase or a clause that gets added on to it, right? So a huge SUV can't stand alone as a complete thought, but it can get attached to a previous thought, and in the process, we might end up with a complete sentence. So fragments are simply sentences that aren't really sentences, right? They're incomplete thoughts masquerading as complete sentences because they either don't have a subject, they don't have a verb, or in some other way, they don't complete and they don't express a complete thought. So usually once you identify a fragment, it's very easy to fix it. You simply add whatever missing element you didn't originally have. Or, like I said, you can attach that fragment to whatever comes before it or whatever comes after it, and that might work too. All right? The other way that we can see a common sentence level mistake is the run-on. So a run-on is kind of the opposite of the fragment. With the fragment, we don't have enough in order to achieve a complete sentence. With a run-on, we have too much, right? So a run-on, sometimes called a fused sentence, is when we have multiple sentences, what could be complete sentences, jammed together, combined, without the proper punctuation separating them. So we like the impulse, we like the idea of combining multiple thoughts, multiple ideas, maybe even multiple clauses into the same sentence. Again, that's what mature writers do. We write compound sentences. We write complex sentences that have more than just one idea. In some cases, there might be multiple actions. There might be multiple subjects. Multiple things are happening. We write a lot of sentences like that. Not all of our sentences will be like that, but it's important to know what to do when we have a sentence that might be kind of long. It has multiple ideas and multiple clauses. Okay? Because if we're dealing with independent clauses, then we know that certain punctuation rules are going to apply. So I don't ask that you guys memorize a lot of grammatical or mechanical concepts, but I would encourage you to learn what an independent clause is. If you don't remember this from high school or middle school, you should remember it. It's one of the most important concepts when it comes to sentence structure and punctuation. Okay? An independent clause is simply a group of words, a clause, that can stand alone as a complete sentence, if you want it to. That's what makes it independent. It has a subject, it has a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. But just because it can stand alone as an individual sentence doesn't mean that we're always going to want it to. Because again, we like some complex sentences. We like to sometimes have a little bit of a longer, more detailed sentence. So if we're going to combine two independent clauses into the same sentence, that's good. We should do that from time to time, but we need to know how to do it. Okay? And a common way that this goes wrong is that we just use a comma between the two independent clauses. So again, look at my example in the notes for this week. So look at the sentence I'm giving you as an example of how we might want to join two independent clauses together in a logical way in a single sentence. The student government election is this week, comma, but I have no idea who will win. We could use a different conjunction, maybe and, but you see the idea. We have two different independent clauses there. The student government election is this week. That's a complete thought. Okay, that could be a standalone sentence if we wanted it to be. And then what comes after my conjunction and comma, I have no idea who will win. That's also an independent clause. It's a short, simple one, but it could stand alone as a complete sentence if we wanted it to. So I want to bring these two independent clauses together because they really sound better together than they would separate. Okay, so how do I bring them together? Well, a lot of times we might just use a comma. We know there's a brief pause maybe between the two independent clauses, so we just throw a comma in there and call it a day. But that's a comma splice. It's a little bit different than a run-on, but it's a similar problem. You have two independent clauses kind of crammed together and you're not doing enough to combine them. So with a run-on, you don't have any punctuation, really, right? You have one independent clause immediately followed by another one. Or you might just have an independent clause followed by something else, but you need something to join them or combine them. You can't just connect them with no connecting tissue. So you need a conjunction or you need something else. But a comma splice is more specific. That's what happens when you're just using a comma to separate two independent clauses. So as I explain in the notes, when you're dealing with two independent clauses and you know you're going to bring them together in the same sentence, there's a really simple fix for a comma splice. It's all about coordinating conjunctions. Okay, so if you look on page 2, well, I guess in the module it's page 2 in my printout, but if you scroll down, you'll see fanboys, which some of you probably already know. That's just an acronym that will help you remember the 7 most common coordinating conjunctions. And conjunctions are really helpful when we want good, successful sentence structure, because we can often avoid mistakes like a comma splice or a run-on simply by using a conjunction. So fanboys, those aren't the only conjunctions, but those are the most common coordinating conjunctions. And you know what coordinating means: bringing things together, organizing, helping to sort of synthesize, bring different things together to achieve some kind of new whole. And that's what we're doing. So look at my example. The student government election is this week, comma, then a conjunction like but or and. That's how I successfully join together those two independent clauses. So you see, a comma is not enough. A comma is not strong enough to join two independent clauses by itself. Okay? But a comma and one of those coordinating conjunctions, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so, one of those coordinating conjunctions with a comma before it, that's enough. That's strong enough to join together those two independent clauses. So that's how you can fix a comma splice. And when it comes to a more run-of-the-mill run-on or a fused sentence, when you have maybe multiple sentences with 0 punctuation between them, again, you can do the same thing. Or, again, you might see one like the example I provided. I have a test on Thursday. It should not be difficult. Yeah, those are two independent clauses. They're really simple. They're really short. In that case, we could probably just put an and in there, right? If the independent clauses are really short, sometimes we can get away without the comma, but at the very least, we need the conjunction, right? Because if we don't have a conjunction, we're going to get breathless. I have a test on Thursday. It should not be difficult, right? We need a pause. we need a break, or we need some kind of connecting tissue like a coordinating conjunction to get us from one idea to the second idea, to get us from one independent clause to the next independent clause, right? So if you have anything complex and lengthy, and you know that you're dealing with two separate independent clauses, look at these options. Think about fanboys. Think about what coordinating conjunctions you might want to use. And remember, if you know you have two independent clauses in the same sentence, you need a comma followed by a coordinating conjunction. That's not the only way to do it, though. You could also use a semicolon to join together the two independent clauses, because a semicolon is stronger than a comma. You could also use some other sort of coordinating or transition words like however, nevertheless, therefore. I'm showing you examples of all the different ways to fix a comma splice, because that's a very common mistake. Just like a run-on is very common, just like a sentence fragment is very common. The goal is not to be perfect and to never commit these mistakes. Mistakes happen, even with professional writers. The key for you guys is to learn some of these basic rules. Learn what an independent clause is. Learn what a comma splice is. Learn what a fragment is. So then you can avoid those things. Learn how to fix those mistakes. So when you're revising and editing your own work, you can eliminate the mistakes before I ever see them. Or, worst case scenario, you make some of these mistakes on a discussion post or an essay, I point them out, and then you can go back and fix them because you know what I'm talking about, and you have the info, you have the fixes, you have the solutions already provided for you in the modules. And if you're struggling with any of this stuff, you can always reach out to me and ask some questions. I'm happy to sit down, spend more time on this. I don't spend a ton of time on it on a week-to-week basis because not everybody needs it. Not everybody's at the same level when it comes to syntax or sentence structure. So if you need more help, I'll provide it. If you don't need any help at all, maybe these aren't super useful, but we only do this periodically when we're working on the big essays, okay? And if I see a lot of improvement before essay 3 or essay 4, maybe we don't have to talk about this stuff when we are working on those essays. But while you're scrolling through the notes, as you're looking through the week 5 overview, take a look at the subject-verb agreement stuff. Also take a look at how to know if you need a comma after an introductory phrase or clause. That's another common mistake. I don't want to go through it right now because it would just take too long. But again, I have examples. I'm explaining the rule. I'm showing you sort of what you need to do in order to make sure that you're following the rule. So read through those notes and keep them handy, because it's not just for essay 1. This is stuff that can help you on all of the major essays, because again, we need to have clean and clear sentences. And these are just some of the most common sentence level errors that I notice when grading. So if we can eliminate most of these, we're going to be in really good shape. Okay, so that's part 1. Let's move on. And part 2 is really all about the writing process. I know this is something you guys have probably heard about before, but it's a lot like syntax. It's a lot like comma rules. You learned this stuff at some point in school, but it was probably a long time ago. Maybe you weren't really paying attention that day. Maybe you just forgot. Maybe you never quite understood and it just kind of passed by and you forgot that you would ever need to know it. But it's always good to refresh our memory about some of these concepts because, yeah, they pop up throughout your educational careers, but there's a reason for that. Because this stuff is important, especially when it comes to academic writing. So what we want to avoid, the reason we like the writing process, is we are trying to avoid the experience that most of us have had of sitting down in front of a blank computer screen. If you use Word, you probably know what a blank Word document looks like. That sort of blinding white light when you haven't put any text on the page. That can be a bad feeling. That can be sort of an overwhelming sensation for a lot of students. And a lot of us try to write from scratch, right? That's the problem. And that's what's so hard, is sitting down and trying to just create an essay off the top of your head without any notes, without any brainstorming, without an outline, without any kind of a plan. You're actually raising the level of difficulty and making it a lot harder on yourself by trying to write that way. Now, maybe not all of us do that. I'm sure at least some of us do that. And with short writing assignments, short, kind of easy writing assignments, like the ones that maybe we did at previous levels of school, maybe we were able to get away with the sit down and crank it out in 2 hours, the night before it's due, fueled by Red Bull, and, anxiety. Maybe that has been your method in the past and maybe it's worked. But typically when you're doing college papers, that method, that style doesn't really work as well. You're often not going to create the kind of quality that we're looking for when you're writing the whole paper in a couple of hours, under the gun, rushing, right? Because it's due very soon. So we want to break writing up, especially when it comes to a big essay. We want to break it up into several different steps, okay? We don't want to do all of this in one night. And that's why I devote an entire week to working on an essay, because it really does take a full week. We need to start with pre-writing. So as I explained in the overview, pre-writing is the first phase of the writing process, and it really includes all the stuff you do before you actually write your essay. So hence the prefix. This is the activities. This is the pregame. This is the stuff you do before the featured event, before the actual paper. So there's lots of different pre-writing activities that we can think about and that I will encourage you to do at the beginning of a week like this. So we can always start simply by brainstorming. Think about the assignment. Step one, really, for the writing process for any big essay, step one will always be to read the assignment instructions. That's why they're always there at the beginning of the week. You need to know what I'm asking for. You need to know what the guidelines are of the assignment. What are the requirements? How long does it need to be? What am I telling you to do? What do you have to include? You need to have a clear handle on all of that. And if you're not clear after reading the assignment sheet, which I always post in the module, email me and we can talk further. Okay, so once you've read the assignment and understood it, once you know what you need to do, you need to start brainstorming potential topics. What do you want to write about? What's your angle? What kind of perspective do you want to capture? What might be your larger narrative point? Those are some of the things we're considering here with Essay 1. You'll have different considerations with different essays. You'll have different purposes. You'll need to include different things, but we know we're writing a narrative. So you can start thinking about those key narrative elements that you know you're going to need to include. What's your plot going to be like? What kind of characters are you going to have? Are you going to be a character? Are you going to be the narrator? Are you going to use a first-person narration style or maybe a third-person style? Where might the setting be? And again, what's the narrative point going to be? What kind of message or meaning do you want to get across to your readers? So you don't have to have all that figured out instantly, but you need to start brainstorming. And as you're brainstorming, you need to start writing stuff down. Start creating a record. Start taking notes. So one common activity for pre-writing is what we call free write. The free write. It rhymes with pre-write. You're just writing freely for 10 or 15 minutes. Don't worry about punctuation or spelling. Don't worry about what it looks like. You are just transferring the ideas from your brain to the page. Okay? Or you can be typing. It doesn't matter. And again, you might have fragments. You might have some unclear sentences. That's fine in pre-writing. Okay? That's fine when you're brainstorming or doing a free write. It only becomes a problem once you have submitted the work. So there's always time to fix stuff. And of course, you'll polish up a lot of these sentences just through the natural process of going through the writing process. So a lot of that gets cleaned up anyway, but it's fine right now if it's very rough. It's fine if it only makes sense to you. Maybe you're sort of using a shorthand or you're abbreviating stuff. That's fine. You just want to get some ideas down on paper. So spend some time doing that early in the week, maybe on Monday, maybe Tuesday. Do some of these idea generation activities. That's another term for what we do during pre-writing. We are simply generating ideas, and we need to get a bunch of those ideas written down. Not everything you write down in these early stages will be keepers, right? You're not going to keep all of this stuff. You might decide to chuck some of it later, but if even 25% of what you jotted down on Monday is going to later make its way into your narrative in some shape or form, then that was still a productive use of your time, right? You came up with a quarter of your narrative on Monday doing these basic idea generation activities. So that's good. There's more to do, right? You're not going to figure everything out in an hour, but you can figure a lot of it out. And you might want to do some other stuff like a storyboard. A lot of you can draw. A lot of you are artistically inclined. So that comes in really handy with a narrative. You might want to start thinking about your narrative like a movie or a TV show. So you might want to start thinking about individual scenes. What's stuff going to look like? You can start, sketching some of it out. Create a storyboard or even something that might sort of resemble a comic or a graphic novel. That's not going to be the end product, but that could help you to visualize what's going to happen in your story. That could help you to assemble the plot, to figure out everything that's going to happen, all the characters that are going to be included, and you have it all sort of sketched out in your notes. That could make it a lot easier to actually start writing it. So that's another, method. I have the clustering method is included. That's another thing where you can just like draw little circles and kind of, make a tree where everything's connected. You start finding relationships between different ideas, maybe different relationships between characters. Figure out conflict, figure out, again, what the plot's going to be, what's going to happen, what's the point, whatever works for you. Some people are, diehard believers in the free write. Other people just brainstorm in a very kind of, haphazard kind of fashion. Just write down whatever comes to you throughout the day. You might not want to sit down and devote 15 minutes at once. You might just kind of do it throughout. Some people want to be more organized, systematic. Again, a timeline or a storyboard could really be helpful for this assignment. But you just want to get some stuff down on paper. And while you're doing this, start thinking about what we call the rhetorical triangle, which we don't really cover in this class, but it's something that all writers have to consider, right? You always have this sort of complex relationship between you, the writer, the subject matter, and then the audience. You're writing for an audience. You have to remember that. So, in addition to understanding the instructions, like what I'm asking for, what is required in the assignment, you also need to think about what your audience wants. And your audience does not just consist of me. Although I'm obviously the most important member of your audience because I'll be the one assessing your work. But just remember, other people could read this, right? I mean, it's up to you. You might not want anybody else to read it, but a lot of times students will get friends or family members or classmates to peer review their drafts. Right? Not always, but it's pretty common. So you could consider your classmates, your friends, your brother, your sister, even your parents, your grandparents, your aunt, your uncle, your neighbor. You could consider any of them to be potential readers, right? They might not all read your narrative, but they could. Maybe they might one day. Who knows? If it's really good and you get an A+ on it, maybe you want to share it with other people, or maybe you ask somebody to look over your rough draft. So now they become an audience member. They become somebody that you are writing for. So you have to think about audience in sort of like, in terms of like potential. A lot of people might not read it, but there's the potential that all of those people, your peers, your family, obviously your instructor, there's a chance that we're all going to read it. So what would we want? What do we need in order to understand what's happening in your narrative? Also, any good storyteller has some sense of their audience's expectations. And then you can decide what you want to do with those expectations. Do you want to satisfy them? Do you want to upset those expectations? Do you want to surprise your readers? Do you want to give them a twist? Do you want to give them something that they did not expect? You can do that. Or do you want to be more of a crowd pleaser? Do you want to give them exactly what you think they want? It's up to you. But you got to think a little bit about your audience. And you know generally about your audience because they are people like you. So think about when you are an audience member. What do you want from your favorite TV show? What do you want when you sit down to watch a movie, or when you sit down to read a book, or even if you're just reading a brief narrative article online? What are your expectations? What do you want the author to do? What do you respond to? What do you like? What do you not like? Okay, because again, a lot of your preferences can be mapped on to your prospective potential audience members because they're probably somewhat similar to you. Not the exact same, but similar enough to where you can make some educated guesses and some safe assumptions. But think about your audience and think about what you want to do in relation to them. Again, it's fine to mess with them. It's fine to give them faulty info or to trick them. But you need to have that as a plan that you're considering and thinking about and mapping out before you sit down to actually write the paper. Another thing that you might want to consider during the early pre-writing stage is the thesis. Now, I do want to make this clear for the narrative because this is the only essay that's going to be like this throughout the semester for us. But in the narrative, you don't necessarily have to state your thesis. Again, we're considering the thesis here to be your theme, your overall narrative point. And as we know, because we've all read narratives, not all narratives will explicitly state their theme. In fact, it can sometimes be considered a little elementary to do that. So you have the choice. If you want to state your theme, your narrative point, if you want to make it very clear, if you want to state it in your essay, you can. Either at the beginning or maybe at the end. It can be sort of emphasized throughout or however you want to do it. But also you're free to not do that. You're free to leave it up to the reader to really figure out what the theme is, what the overall point is. Because we know, especially with fiction, right? If you're writing a fictional story, usually the author doesn't just tell you. They want you to be able to figure it out. They might make it pretty clear based on what happens in the story, what happens to the characters, what the narrator tells us. Like, the theme might be made pretty clear, but it's not always like spelled out in a sentence. So if you want to do it that way, you can. If you don't want to state the thesis in such an obvious way, that's fine too. But you need to have one, right? And you need to write it down during the brainstorming, during your free write, during the early idea generation stage, even if it's not going to make the cut in the actual essay. Even if it's not going to appear in the final draft of your narrative, you still need to be clear on it yourself. You need to know it. You need to have it in writing. You need to be thinking about it so you can then express it in other ways. If you don't just want to say it in the essay, that's all right, but you'll be able to come up with other ways to make it clear because you have it in mind, you have it in writing, it's in your notes, and you can do stuff with it. Okay? But start thinking, like, what's my point? What's my purpose? What's the major takeaway that I want my readers to have once they finish my story? Okay? And again, write it down now, even if you're not going to write it out in the essay itself. So once you've done those kinds of idea generation things, it's time to outline. And once you've outlined, it's time to make a schedule. So let's talk about these two because I'm really big on these. And for every major essay, I'll always post a sample outline in the modules. So right now you can go and look at the outline for the descriptive narrative. It's going to look like this, okay? So it's not super detailed, but I'm just sort of showing you what an outline looks like. You don't have to follow mine to a T. I just want to give you an example so you can make your own. Everybody needs to have their own outline. And you can do it on your computer, you can do it by hand. It really doesn't matter, but before you start drafting, before you move on to the next phase of the writing process, you need to have a complete outline. So I provide an example, you can use it, you can just glance at it before you make your own, whatever. But you should have an outline done before you sit down to write the essay. So I usually recommend having the outline finished by maybe Wednesday or Thursday. It really depends on your schedule. So that's why I also encourage you guys to make a writing schedule. Okay? Figure out when you have time to work on this. And again, start from Monday. Start from the very beginning of the week. I'm going to do some idea generation on Monday. I have to work on Tuesday, so I'm not going to do anything paper related that day. On Wednesday, I'm going to hammer out my outline, so I'll be ready to start writing my rough draft on Thursday. As long as you're sitting down to write maybe on Thursday, no later than Friday, you're in good shape. Time-wise, that's pretty good. But I don't know your schedules. I don't know when you guys have other classes. I don't know when you have to go to work or do family stuff. So the only person that can make a schedule for you is you. So you know what your week looks like. You know when you have free time. So start blocking off some time to do some of these different steps of the writing process. So give yourself some time to do an outline. Give yourself some time to work on a rough draft. And then finally, give yourself some time to do post-writing, which means revising and editing. But just a couple more words on the outline before we move on. Think of the outline as your blueprint for the essay. It is the plan for the essay. That's all an outline is. But look at my example. You'll notice that I'm providing a plan for each individual paragraph that I intend to write. I want you guys to do that too. Again, yours doesn't have to look just like mine, but you need to be doing what I'm doing. So I have my introductory paragraph planned out. I'm going to have an opening hook. I'm going to present key information. And I'm going to be super obvious and just state my thesis like I would in any other paper. That's my intro. I have a plan. Now I'm ready to write it because I know what I'm doing. Moving on to the body paragraphs. I have a plan for those as well, right? That's what I want you guys to do. And you need multiple bodies, right? We're not writing something super brief. So you can plan to have an introductory paragraph. This is true for any essay we write. You can plan to have an introductory paragraph and then at least 3 to 5 body paragraphs. To hit our length requirement, you gotta have somewhere in that range. And then you're going to have a concluding paragraph. So you can plan for those paragraphs. You don't have to know the exact number of bodies. You might not know that until you actually start writing. But you need to have a general idea. You know you're going to have an intro. You know you're going to have a conclusion. And you know you're going to have at least 3 bodies. At least. Maybe more. So go ahead and plan the intro, 3 bodies, and the conclusion. What are you going to do in those paragraphs? So I walked you through the intro. The bodies are going to be a little bit more imaginative. It's all about your plot and your characters and your setting and your conflict. What's going on? What's going on in this paragraph? What actions are taking place? What characters are we following? What information do you need to give your readers? What about the second paragraph? What's going on? Right? Sometimes you can maybe plan 2 paragraphs at once. Again, think about scenes. Think about imagery. Think about visuals. What's this going to look like? Are you going to have an extended battle scene? Maybe that takes up 3 paragraphs. Who's in it? Where are we? Who wins? What's going to happen? Start planning that stuff out. And again, when you're outlining, you don't have to use complete sentences. You can use bullet points like I am. You can just jot down sort of notes, placeholders, and come back and, you're going to fill it in later. It's just a plan. And my recommendation is once you have the outline finished, again, hopefully no later than Friday, you can sit down with that outline either sitting next to you or pulled up on your screen, and that's how you start drafting. See, drafting is the second phase of the writing process, and it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't have as many steps. It's just creating a complete draft. But the first draft will be a rough draft. It's not your final draft, right? But the first thing you got to do with drafting is just write. Don't worry so much about errors, all the stuff we were talking about in the first half. We'll have time to fix those later. This is just a rough draft. So you're focusing on taking these kind of, abbreviated bullet point ideas from your outline, and now you're fleshing them out. Now you're elaborating on them. Now you're saying everything that you want to say. What you should strive for when you're writing the rough draft is completion. Completion above all else. It's not going to be pretty always. It's not going to be perfect. There's going to be mistakes that you have to clean up. But your goal is to write everything that you want to write. So you end up with a complete rough draft. Now it's rough. It has mistakes. It's going to have some sentences that we need to work on. But you have all the key ideas, all the major stuff that you want. Okay? All right, so once you're done with the rough draft, you're done with drafting. If possible, take a little break, okay? Maybe it's Saturday. Maybe it's Sunday morning. That's okay. If you're finished drafting by early Sunday, take a break, even if it's just an hour or 2. Get away from the paper. Do something else. Go for a run, watch your favorite show, hang out with a friend, get a cup of coffee, take your mind off the work, maybe do some other schoolwork if you have other stuff due, and then come back if you have the time. Now, again, you have to manage your time well and follow your schedule. But if you have time and you need to leave at least a little bit of time for the final stage of the writing process, which is post-writing, everything that we do after we have a complete rough draft. So when I talk about post-writing, I'm talking about revising and editing. Sometimes these terms are thought of as synonymous, but they're actually not the same. They're related, they're like cousins, but they're not brother and sister. They're similar, but they're different. Okay, revising just means that you're making general improvements to your paper. This could mean a lot of things. There's sentence level revising, there's paragraph level revising, and you really need to be thinking about your paragraphs by this point. We started with sentences. We're going to end with paragraphs, both when you outline and when you're actually putting the paper together. So there can be paragraph level revision, sentence level revision, and then even bigger picture revision, like, what is my narrative point? Is it clear? Why is this character doing that? I never really explain that particular action, or I don't explain how they end up in Malibu in this particular scene, right? Sometimes revising is just tying up loose ends, noticing that you forgot to mention something, noticing that you maybe, had some other like oversight. It can be anything. It might be a sentence that's unclear, a sentence that just doesn't sound good. It's not really capturing your meaning. It might be a description that doesn't really deliver the dominant impression that you want. It just doesn't quite sound right. These might not be sentences that have grammatical mistakes or punctuated incorrectly. They might just not sound the way you want them to sound. They might just not be as clear as you want them to be. So when you're revising, you're fixing those problems. You might want to make a few changes to some of your sentences. You might see an individual paragraph that's not really working. Nothing happens in this paragraph. It's boring. Maybe you want to attach it to another paragraph. Maybe you want to add something to it. Maybe you just want to cut it. The unfortunate reality about revision is that sometimes you're making additions, but other times you're making subtractions. You might find a sentence or even an entire paragraph that's just not good. Like, don't feel bad. It happens. It's not a reflection on you. It just wasn't your best work. Or maybe you've moved beyond it. You thought you were going to talk about that, but you didn't really end up returning to it at any point. Your plot went in a different direction. So just get rid of it, right? You thought you were going to use it, but it turns out it doesn't really work. You don't really need it. So cut it. I know it's painful to cut stuff that you've been working on and writing, but if it's not helping, if it's not advancing your narrative, get rid of it, especially if you're safely at the length requirement. You can lose a sentence. You might be able to lose a whole paragraph if you've written enough. So don't hesitate to make cuts when you need to. In the case of paragraph level revision, sometimes you have to rearrange paragraphs. They might be good paragraphs, but maybe they're not in the right order. Maybe you change your mind about your narrative sequence and you decide, actually, I want a flashback here. I want this action to occur sooner, or I want the readers to get to it sooner, or I want it to happen later. So you can move paragraphs around. You can do anything you need to do during revision to improve the draft. Again, that could mean cleaning up a weird sounding sentence. That could mean rearranging your paragraphs. That could mean cutting an entire part of your narrative because it's just not working anymore. So revision is just general improvement. Give yourself a half hour to an hour to do that. And then the final step, the final part of the writing process is editing. Editing means you are looking for and correcting mistakes. Now, while you're revising, you might be doing some editing as well. These two do bleed into each other a little bit. You might just find some mistakes. Oh, I forgot my period at the end of this sentence. Oh, I need a comma after this introductory phrase. Oh, this is a comma splice. I have two independent clauses here with only a comma joining them. Let me think of fanboys and add a conjunction. You can do some of that stuff while you're revising. But you're never going to catch everything until you go back and do one final round of proofreading. Just go back through your draft. You need to read it twice during post-writing. Read through the draft once to revise and make those changes. And then go back and read through the rough draft a second time while editing. Clean up the mistakes. By the time you're editing, you're not really worried about content anymore. Everything sounds pretty good. You got your ideas. The length is good. You're telling your story. You got your narrative point. When you're editing, you're just focused on mistakes, missing punctuation, any kind of grammatical issue, like an incomplete sentence. This is the last chance to fix that stuff. If you can fix it during the editing step, then I'm never going to see those mistakes. I'm never going to dock you points for them. But if you don't edit, and you simply send in the rough draft, if you finished it on Friday and don't do anything with it until Sunday and just say, hey, I'm done, I'm going to submit, then I guarantee you there's mistakes that you missed. There's revisions that you needed to make, because that's true of any writer with any assignment ever in the history of the world. It's never finished after the rough draft. The rough draft is just that, rough. To make it a final draft, you have to revise and you have to edit. At least give yourself an hour or two to complete those post-writing steps before you submit. It will make a huge difference, I promise. For most of you, it will make a big difference. If you can do some editing, make some fixes, because if you don't, you will lose, in some cases, a lot of points, right? If I see a lot of mistakes, your grade does suffer, even if the content's good, even if the ideas are good. So just think of revising and editing as the cleanup work. Post-writing is when you clean up the mistakes. And it's when you're revising and editing that I want you guys to go back to these sentence structure notes that we spent the first half of lecture on. They'll always be in the week 5 module. I might repost them in future modules, but it's during post writing that you need to really go back and analyze some of your individual sentences. Make sure everything sounds good. Make sure everything looks good. Make the fixes that you need to make, and never feel bad because everybody makes mistakes. The key is, can you find and eliminate most of your mistakes? That's what we want, okay? And I'm always here to help if you need it. So good luck. Email me with questions, and I'll see you next week as we get started on our second unit, analysis.